surprising. Our speaker today is Dave Schindler, who's one of the best-known ecologists in the world. Dave is at the University of Alberta. For those of you who've had introductory ecology or environmental sciences, you know his work on whole lake ecosystem manipulations. So they pioneered splitting lakes and applying nitrogen and phosphorus and combinations of nutrients and conditions, essentially in paired comparisons, which is something that we try and do in terrestrial ecosystems, but can't quite do so accurately the way they've done it in aquatic systems. So I promise you've seen his work in textbooks. Dave is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the Royal Societies of both England and Canada. He's received many awards, most notably the Hutchinson Medal from the American Society of Limnology and Oceanography, the Naumann Medal from the International Limnology Society, and the 2006 Tyler Prize, which is one of the largest, most prominent environmental awards in the world. Lately, still involved in long-term data analysis associated with the lakes experiments, but recently we've been working on the subjects we'll talk to us today about, the oil sands, some water consequences of that, and this little thing some of you have heard about recently, the Keystone Pipeline. So, with no further ado, Dave Schindler.
Thank you, and thank you for all turning out to hear me today. This visit sort of stemmed from an email exchange that Emily Bernhardt and I had rather by accident, where we got comparing some of the impacts of mountaintop coal mining and the oil sands to unconventional sources of energy that have become very popular recently. So I thought that you probably would know as little about the oil sands as I do about the mountaintop mining. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of an introduction, not only to some of the environmental problems, but some of the social and political problems. Well, this picture that we're looking at was taken several years ago. This is the Athabasca River, which flows north into the Mackenzie system and then via the Mackenzie to the Beaufort Sea. And this is the first oil sands plant, Suncor, which began operating in 1967. They began adding tailings to these big ponds, which they artificially constructed on the edge of the Athabasca River. Their initial thought was that these would detoxify themselves in a few years and then they could discharge the water. But what happened is, as the decades have gone by, they've kept adding and adding and adding to where, as you see here, to give you some scale, that's 100 meters high. And there are these huge ponds of very toxic material. This is water that was heated up to extract bitumen from this clay and sand matrix in which it's embedded, that they call the oil sands, or the more derogatory term tar sands, which is what they used to be called. And they'll reuse that water 18 or 19 times, which industry is always delighted to tell you. What they don't say is that when they're done with that, it's so toxic that they have to hold it in these ponds. They're not allowed to discharge it until it meets water quality standards. In the 40-some years that they've been operating, there's not a single one of these that has come anywhere near standards that they can discharge. They're still as toxic, or almost as toxic, as they ever were. This is to orient you for scale and time. The Athabasca River flows across the province northeasterly, and it turns due north at Fort McMurray, which used to be a little trapping town of a few thousand people. It's now around 100,000. And then this area is the open pit mines of the tar sands. The red area is where they can use another method known as in situ, where they put a pipe down, pump either steam or solvent down the pipe, and mobilize this bitumen from the sand in situ. And when it flows to another side-by-side pipe, they can haul it this gives you an idea of scale. These are thousands of square kilometers. I think we could get rid of a lot of problems if we could just saw off Greece and get the EU to give us Greece and give them the oil sands. They're about the same size. We have a real issue in Canada. This one would mean more if you were Canadian, but we've had this contaminated site in the Halifax area known as the Sydney tar ponds, which has many of the same pollutants. It's been debated about cleaning that up for decades, but it's always too expensive. It gives you a relative size, and the pollutants and their concentrations are not too different from the tar sands. So I think that would be a warning. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is in this little pink area. This is the area where these sands are near enough to the surface that they simply shovel off the overburden and use open pit mining techniques. The rest, the big red area, which is the 140,000 square kilometers here, will be in situ extraction. So here's the Athabasca. It starts in Jasper National Park, right on the continental divide of the Rockies in the Athabasca Glacier, which is eroding rapidly, and it flows across the province, and this blow-up gives you this northern part, Fort McMurray, these developments, and then downstream, the next thing going downstream that's of any note is the Peace Athabasca Delta, where three rivers, the Peace being the biggest, comes in from here. The Athabasca is second biggest, and the Birch River, which is still a fairly sizable river, a couple hundred cubic meters per second on average, all flow into this huge delta area known as the Peace Athabasca Delta. In that delta is the oldest community in Alberta, Fort Chipewyan, which is where Alexander Mackenzie set up shop when he did his initial survey of the Mackenzie River system, looking for the pathway to the Orient and so forth. So there's been white people through that area since before 1800. And the tar sands were known actually from Mackenzie's logs, and even earlier from Peter Pond's and other early explorers' logs, because that's where all of the native people that they employed stopped to repair their leaky canoes with the tarry substances that were seeping out of the banks. So recently this has been big promoted. Politicians are fascinated with this area because all politicians worship the same God, economy. And if economy is pleased, the politician looks good, and it's an easy way to go down in history as a great leader, to sit back and watch the coffers fill with money and people be employed. So there's been a lot of effort put into promotion, including here in Washington. And this is taken from a speech by Ed Stelmach, who was premier until midsummer of this year. All of the good things about the oil sands and how it has some of the most stringent environmental regulations in the world, which I have a somewhat different perspective on. And this shows you what has happened. The black line here is the price of oil over the years, and the bars are production. You can see the scales on the two sides. And these little arrows indicate plants that are already approved, that are in being constructed. Shell Albion has just started up. Imperial's Curl Mine, which will be the biggest of all, will be starting up by the end of 2012. Jocelyn was just approved last year. It's a French-owned mine. There's a Shell expansion, which is coming up next month for approval, and two more approvals are going forward this year. These are just the open pit mines. If you include the in situ mines, there have been 3,000 of these go before the Energy Resources Conservation Board, which is 3 engineers who hear these, and most of the concerns are social and environmental. but peculiarly, you need the breadth, so you have to have 3 engineers hear all of these things. The score is 3,000 approvals to no disapprovals so far. And if you just take that projection and you do the numbers, it works out to 7.5% a year increase compounded. If you look at development of almost anything, that's a crazy rate of development. Population increase in any city, infrastructure increase, roads increase, it just, something outstrips everything else. Fort McMurray has exploded from 7,000 people to 100,000. When I started going there, it was a 2-lane dirt road that stretched for 500 kilometers. Now they're just finishing 4-laning it. Their hospitals are exploding. A house that would be $150,000 in Edmonton is $600,000. And it's very likely that it's going to have a problem. About 1 in 4 has had a construction problem that people have been forced to vacate until the problems are fixed. So hospitals are overcrowded, schools are overcrowded, all sorts of problems going on. And the projected increase is 2 more doublings. This works out to a doubling every 10 years. They're projecting 2 more doublings in the next 20 years. And I think they figure the public have all just fallen off a turnip truck. These ERCB hearings pretend that they do cumulative effects assessment. When you look at what's done, the companies are required to do cumulative effects assessment on their own development. And each of these projects is about 100 square kilometers, or about the size of a township. Every one done by consultants who are hired by the companies, of course, and looking for more business, declares that there's no cumulative impact. Wonder of wonders. So you get in an airplane over this area, this is what no cumulative impact looks like. I think you could fill a plane full of chosen village idiots from around the world and fly them over this area and ask them, is there any significant ecological impact? And you'd get the answer that I would give them, but this is what they conclude. And a lot of people until recently haven't seen this development. And this is one of the reasons they've been able to get away with developing. They're hidden away in the bush at the end of a road that's 200 kilometers long, no gas stations, no places to eat, no places to stay. So they've been tucked away in the bush. And some of these companies have forgotten that in the last few years, the idiots around the world have learned to check them out via Google Earth. So they're getting away with less than they did in the past. In addition, there have been a few what they consider extreme left-wing think tanks set up. Places like the Marshall Institute and so on, those would be dead center in Alberta's terms. So any organization like the Parkland Institute, which is at the University of Alberta, who comes up with statements like this has to be extreme left-wing. But these are the real sort of financial figures. You have to wonder, you've seen now the development figures. Alberta has a $6 billion debt this year. How can you have royalties on a development at 7.5% a year, run a $6 billion debt? The equation just doesn't add up. So you get a good idea of the kind of thing that's going on. And this is my list, copied after the premieres. But I'll give you an idea of what reclamation looks like. I won't touch on CO2. You can find that stuff on the web very easily. Unsustainable water use. Each one of these developments is taking through 3 cubic meters per second from the river. Stacks up right now to be a maximum of about 33, and they like to quote you that this is a fraction of the 700 cubic meters per second of average flow. But the true measure of concern comes in wintertime when the flows are less than 100 and dropping. And the river's sealed under ice, it can be as much as a third of the flow, and they don't like to hear that. Water pollution, they have claimed that there isn't any, and I'll spend most of my time talking about that. They, of course, strip the boreal, and it's obvious what happens to all the large predators and mammals. Acid precipitation problems, some social problems, like they guaranteed a lot of this land to First Nations under Treaty 8 of 1899. And you can imagine how many fish and wildlife an area like I just showed you supports. Social disruptions in Fort Chipewyan and Fort Mackay, big drug problems, all of these new immigrants coming in, most of them 20-ish young males with lots of money. So you can imagine the kinds of social problems that develop. And as I showed you, the cumulative effects assessment leaves a little bit to be desired. The politicians and the oil kings have this new promotion, the essence of which is to say, oh, you shouldn't be taking that dirty Mideastern oil. Those people are mean to their women, and on and on. You should be taking nice, ethical Canadian oil. This is a friendly country, and they have high environmental standards. But I don't know, is it more ethical to mistreat your women or to mistreat a whole culture? Eastern Canada doesn't get any of this oil. We import over 800,000 barrels a day from these same unethical sources because most of our production goes to the U.S. And reclamation, we have virtually no reclamation, as I'll show you after 40 years. So it's our children or grandchildren who are going to deal the cleanup costs, and meanwhile most of the profits are going to multinationals, not to Alberta, as you can imagine by these unbalanced budget statistics. And they have a propaganda budget that was $25 million last year for billboards in Times Square and promoting tar sands in Europe and so forth. Alberta Environment had a budget of $300,000 to study the impact. And this is picked up even more. You have read in the papers today about Obama turning down the Keystone pipeline. I say hooray for Obama. What's the hurry of these things? Let's get it right. And he said, we're not turning this down, we're turning down this application. We want to see a full environmental assessment. This is our Minister of Natural Resources. There's an alternate proposed pipeline to the West Coast where now that the nasty Americans don't want our oil, we're going to sell it to China. The problem with this is they have to go through the land of 71 First Nations, none of which have ever had even a treaty. So in the eyes of the courts, they own the land. 70 of the 71 have said there's no way we're approving this. And it's claimed that all of the dissent is being funded by Americans, left-wing extremist groups with money, Robert Redford, James Cameron, and so on. Of course, you think of the other side, and this is American money driving the development and the promotion to it. How come that isn't bad? So it should be a level playing field. Either ban all foreign money from either side, or don't worry about it, which is more like it. So my perspective is environmental groups don't get listened to very much. What the people who get listened to are ex-premiers from the same party that's in power now, who are against the rapid expansion. These carbon cutting programs where there are journalists smart enough to do the numbers. We don't have politicians smart enough, but the average journalist is a little bit smarter. And ex-conservative ministers of the environment who have urged them to slow down. I think industry people listen to folks like this. They don't listen to Greenpeace. And then there are companies who do it to themselves. Some of you may have heard of this incident. There are 140 square kilometers of those tar ponds, like I showed you, where they discharge this bitumen. Some of the bitumen floats up and forms a tarry layer on the top. Woe to any duck that lands in that. In spring, when the migrations are underway, or in the fall, same thing. If there's a bad weather event, there's no other places to sit down. These things have no ice on them. They tend to fly in. And if you look at how these operate, they have scarecrows on buoys and radar-powered cannons that when they detect a flock of ducks, the cannons start booming, things to try and deter them. Well, they were slow in getting their things deployed a couple of years ago, and they had 1,600 mallards land. It's well known that this happens all the time, but usually the public doesn't see this. They have hired duck skimmers who go around and skim up the dead birds off these ponds so they're not visible. But a journalist happened to see this and took a bunch of photos. Syncrude denied that it was their fault. And every day we have pictures of dead ducks in tar on the papers for a year, as Syncrude's lawyer argued that this was the duck's fault, not Syncrude. Things like that, it was like Greenpeace was funding their defense, not Syncrude. Gave Syncrude a terrible reputation among people who would have normally been on side. They ended up paying a big fine anyhow. So I can't think of a worse industrial tactic. And of course, this stuff was heavily played in Europe and so on. And they blame Greenpeace for their bad image. I can't believe what's going on. The volume of these tailings ponds is something else. This is the biggest one in the tar sands. Outside of the tar sands, this huge lead zinc mine at Faro in the Yukon is the next biggest. So you can see the volume here in thousands of cubic meters. You can imagine what would happen if one of those breached into the Athabasca. They'll deny that this could ever happen. They'll show you the risk analyses. They're very low. They're right down there with a tsunami causing a nuclear power plant accident or a deep water blowout. So, and then you calculate the probability of 2 or more of those happening in the same year, and they're astronomically low. And I think what you learn is that when you get to really rare events, risk analysis is not a very useful tool. It's great for car accidents and so on, where you get thousands per year. But when you try to calculate the risk of an event that hasn't occurred before, it happens once a decade or something. I had a group of students for a class project do an analysis a few years ago. They looked for cases of tailings ponds failure, and they came up with 184 of them in a 20-year period. This is one in Spain, tiny one by oil sands standards of effluent that was not very toxic by comparison. The cleanup costs were in the billions of dollars. And the breakdown of why these occurred for a wide variety of reasons. These tailings ponds are known to have seepage going through them. The dikes are known to be creeping outward. You can imagine when they were designed to be 10 meters high and they're on unstable substrates near the shore of a river, and they're gradually built up where there's 100 meters of hydraulic head on them. They've been a deterrent to selling these properties. In the days when oil prices were low, Syncrude and Suncor were trying to sell their holdings, and they couldn't find any investors because they'd come and look at these tailings ponds and, well, we're not taking on that sort of liability. So, let's see, I lost my place here. Well, this is sort of what the terrain looks like. 60% of it is what a wetland scientist would call wooded fen. Basically, these big flat wetland areas, typically 2 to 5 or 6 meters of peat, and a few spindly trees coming out of the top. Usually not merchantable. Huge carbon storage in these, and they literally bulldoze this aside to get at these substrates, and then they're required to reclaim. Right now, their reclamation that's been certified as successful is 0.1% of what they've dug up. This is it. This is called a reclaimed system. On TV, they tell people that they're putting it back just the way it was. This is what's called the Syncrude Gateway Hill project, which they're very proud of. I guess the fact that the trees are all in lines doesn't matter. But this was an easy site, which they admit. They bulldozed this big pile of sand, and they planted trees and grasses on it, and then stocked some bison on it. So they have this big bison pasture that they take all their visitors to. But when you look at the costs, this is what they're required to put aside for reclamation. Around $12,000 per hectare. This is what Gateway, this easy project, actually cost. Discrepancy of tenfold. And then you compare what other jurisdictions require for reclamation to be put aside, and we're the lowest in any site in North America. So guess who's going to make up that difference? The companies will scram by the time they get around to reclaiming. They flash pictures of things like Gateway, usually not from an overhead where you can see the rows, the beautiful trees from down below and things. You never see pictures like this. This was taken for me by a student both. You're not allowed to take cameras on the site, so the odd person will sneak on a camera. This is an unsuccessful reclamation project, and there are lots of these. And another student of my wife's has come up with some studies of this. This is from Alberta Environment's own figure. This is called the reclamation debt. This white area is what they have under active reclamation, meaning they're busy doing something with it. And the gray area, they're doing nothing with at all. So we have this accumulating, spreading pit, and very little being done. But on TV, they tell you how they'll put it back just the way it was. You won't be able to see the details of this. It's coming out in the proceedings of the U.S. National Academy in about 2 weeks. What this graduate student, Rebecca Rooney, did was to take company statistics, which she got out of their environmental impact statements, and figure out and map by GIS what they were really going to put back. This is the original ecosystem, with most of these gray and brown areas being fens or wooded fens. This map represents what they're putting back. And what it is an area of low hills. It won't be flat at all. The reason is that they have these end pit lakes. They're allowed to leave the last pit that they dig, and with some toxic water in it. What their plans are to cap that with about 10 meters of fresh water and declare it a lake. And they claim that these lakes will support fish someday, and driven by politicians, the federal fisheries and oceans people accept those as replacement fish habitat. Fisheries Act says that there shall be no net loss of fish habitat. They're digging up streams at the rates of tens per square kilometer, and by streams I'm talking 40,000 cubic meters, or 40 cubic meters per second. These are regarded as replacement habitat, even though not a single case has been proven to support any aquatic life so far. And the oldest one is now 17 years old. It supports nothing. The wetlands that they'll put back are these little features. There'll be long, thin strips between the hills. There'll be saline water, so they might claim they're going to be the way they were, but they won't support ombrotrophic bog or fen plants. What they will support is the sort of saline species you'd find around marshes in closed basin lakes in Saskatchewan. High salinity tolerant vegetation. The carbon loss is astronomical because of all of the peat here that'll be dug up, the very little peat after this is done, and the carbon sequestration is permanently impaired. So that's the basis of this paper. We compare that based on the company's own statistics, which haven't seen the light of day since the environmental impact statements, versus what their claims are. So clear case of greenwashing. And of course, there are a lot of species of concern in those natural areas. Woodland caribou are on the skids. You can see I haven't been able to update this. There's a couple of studies in press, but couldn't get my hands on them yet. But woodland caribou are declining rapidly. So are all of the large predators except coyotes. And boreal songbirds are on the decline, and on and on and on. So some big reclamation issues. Most of this activity is on Treaty 8 land. The reddish area here is all within Alberta. Treaty 8 extends over into British Columbia and into Northwest Territories and Saskatchewan. It's a huge area. The red area here is the oil sands and heavy oil area developing in the southern part. And you can see the native communities, Fort Mackay, Fort Chippewa, and I mentioned the two tribes there, the Cree and the Chippewa, and down here, other native communities. So they're leasing land that was guaranteed to support these people for time immemorial. And this is just a map of one tribe. This is the Chippewayan in Fort Chip. Their territories that they were guaranteed are in the red line. The little spots here in purple are existing wells that have already been built. And the hatched areas are lands that were leased from under these people by the Alberta government. The people were pretty well hoodwinked out of their land. You can follow the correspondence of this. It was actually all put together by a retired priest who had worked in the area for 50 years, retired to Calgary in the 1990s, and wrote up all of his interviews with people and so on. Pierre Lacombe was a very famous pioneering missionary, was dragged out of retirement, very sick in the late 1890s, because he was the only person with a white skin that the Aboriginal people trusted, and dragged north, and basically to persuade people to sell this land, or to treat, that they would share it with the whites. There were never any skirmishes or anything. People's philosophy was, well, we'll share our resources. But they were told things like, you will be given $3 every year for every one of you for this worthless land. And we won't be back to make this offer again. You'd better take it now. And all of these old people that Father Familio persuaded. And these stories go on and on. Every interview is much the same. This is from a person who was 107, who was present at the Treaty 8 signing in 1899. And no one will ever stop you from these. And this is a consistent story, not only in Treaty 8, but all the other areas. Well, this is like straight out of a B Western. How can you support a subsistence lifestyle on the kind of development that we've seen, and yet that pretense is still going on? There have been a number of native court challenges started, but usually on a single development there's only one or two communities, and the standard thing is the company goes in with a bag of money and hands it off, and in going to be on this gateway pipeline across BC. So these native rights were recognized by the constitutional amendment in 1982. And the courts, in the few cases that have gone forward, always favored native people. So clearly there's a major dust-up coming. For the area that I've worked on, the Athabasca and downstream, Fort Chippewa, one of the big concerns is the perception that cancers are increasing in the area. The government response was, well, how can there be an increased cancer caused by the oil sands because we're not emitting anything to air or water? And see, here's our data that show it. But when the first reasonably thorough study was done, and this is an epidemiology study of about 1,500 people, they did find that the cancer rate was at the upper edge of what would be considered normal. And this cancer board recommended that further study was needed, much to the irritation of politicians who to this day will tell you there's no evidence of any increase in cancer. On top of that, some of the cancers that are being seen in these communities are very rare types. The Alberta government official position to this day is still this, that their monitoring stations show that nothing is getting into the river. They say it's all natural. Well, there are lots of these little natural seeps like this. You might be able, if you put a bucket under one of these, to catch a liter in 24 hours in the summertime. They don't flow in the winter. They've been known for a long time, but they'd like you to think that things like this are of no consequence. This is the mainstream Athabasca down here. This is happening on several big tributaries in the area, but anyone who's read the Hubbard Brook work or the ELA work or the Walker Branch work or anything knows that Water Science 101 is you don't strip off soils and vegetation and expect nothing additional to come off those watersheds when rain and snow hit them and measure the runoff. It violates every principle of watershed biogeochemistry. And they don't measure what comes out of the stacks and falls back into the biosphere. It's been ignored. There's been no measures since the 1970s. I've been arguing for a long time that this had to be a reasonable source. The reason I've been arguing that is that I chaired a National Academy panel over 30 years ago that didn't find a single smelter or a single fossil fuel fired facility that did not emit toxins to the atmosphere and fall back into the biosphere. So if the government was right for the oil sands, it would have been like discovering an immaculate conception. And yet they burn coke, one of the dirtiest fuels known, and they smelt this bitumen, which has a lot of volatile things in it. So there were lots of things that didn't add up. On top of that, I hope you can read this. I couldn't come up with a color that would bring all of this out. I didn't choose a very good one. This recent monitoring since 1997 has been done by the Regional Aquatic Monitoring Program, which is funded by industry. The idea was that it would be run by a panel of stakeholders, but industry called the shots, and over the years, the First Nations and NGOs fell away to where, when I did a review last year for a paper in Nature, there were 13 companies, 8 government agencies, 1 Aboriginal band, no NGOs running it. And it's been very secretive. They didn't make their data public until forced to last year. They were reviewed in 2004. They didn't like the review because it was 99 out of 100 pages of scathing criticism. No university department or government department would ever survive that kind of review. They were reviewed again, reporting just about exactly a year ago. The only thing they'd improved on was that they'd gotten themselves re-reviewed. and they promised to make the data public, and that's happened. But this program should be toast. It's like they read the book of how to do a monitoring program and then chosen to violate every rule. Most of their monitoring is once a year in September. It's a season that nothing in the fish community is spawning. The sites they chose had no logic. It seemed to be where it was nice to land boats and have coffee. They changed methods of types of dredges, types of water samples. The chemistry every year was done by whoever got the lowest bid. There was no attempt to intercalibrate chemical laboratories. The minister likes to brag they had 4 million data points. And I had this argument with the minister at lunch in 2007, got nowhere. Then you looked at Alberta Environment's own program. They had stations on the Athabasca represented by these 5-pointed stars, and on the tributaries represented by the 4-pointed stars. They're only at the mouths on the tributaries, and yet somehow they can conclude that industry is having no effect. So how can you measure below industry and natural sources and reach that conclusion? And it's totally lost on the minister. And then on top of things, starting in 2001, they were required to keep track of their emissions to the atmosphere and report these to Environment Canada. But this was a secret file until Sierra Legal Defense and a couple of other agencies took them to court, and the courts ordered this had to be made public. So now all you have to do is a Google on the letters NPRI, and this huge table pops up with your favorite company and favorite contaminant. You can follow for years how much they put out. Most of them have data since 2001. Here's atmospheric emissions of 3 pollutants and most other pollutants that you choose to look at. It's the same thing. Escalating amounts going out these stacks. So with all of these things going on, by coincidence, in 2005 there was a spill of bunker C oil as a result of a train derailment into a local lake. And they assembled a panel of experts to help them build a case for prosecuting the railway company. And among them were myself, Jeff Short, who was a NOAA scientist who had worked out of Juneau for 20 years on the chemistry of the following the Exxon Valdez spill. Peter Hodson, who is an ecotoxicologist with a lot of oil sands experiment. We decided to go after the money to do our own study. We hired Erin Kelly, who'd done her PhD with me a few years before working on mercury. And we set up this plan where we mapped the formation with the bitumen in it by GIS, and then plotted all of the streams and sampled 3 spots on the streams upstream of the natural sources outside the McMurray Formation, downstream of natural sources, and then downstream of industry plus natural sources. And going from south to north as the river flows, several sites along the Athabasca system. And at those sites we also measured what was falling in snow. So this would just be an example. This is the Muskeg River, which is now one of the most torn up rivers. Site MU1 was outside of the McMurray Formation, which is this whitish color. MU2 would be upstream of any industry, but within this formation, and MU3 is down below the industrial development. So we had a scheme like that for several of the impacted and some unimpacted rivers. We measured PAHs, and also actually we measured 37 different elements, but for brevity we chose to take the ones that were on EPA's priority pollutant list that were also among those that we measured as the focus for the paper. Most of you have seen PAHs. These are some popular examples. Benzoate pyrene is the the main pH that's carcinogenic in cigarette smoke, for example. The ones we're concerned about are a little bit different. A lot of them are alkylated. They have a little straight chain hydrocarbon hanging off one of the corners or something, but I couldn't find a diagram. But you can envision these little, as you know, chemically they look like little snips of chicken wire in structure. And these were found to be very toxic after the Exxon Valdez. They have publications showing that they're still depressing sea otter and some of the sea ducks' reproduction 20 years later. The secret to their studies was these membrane devices that they had developed at NOAA, where they had these 4-inch sections of aluminum pipe with little places within where you could wind these membranes that would accumulate polycyclic aromatics, and then you could just leave these for a month to come to equilibrium, pull the membrane and extract it. And they found they got numbers that were in very good agreement with the straight numbers, except they were 100 to 1,000 times more sensitive. Well, remember, George Bush was in power. They couldn't get enough money to use their samplers, so we just borrowed them for a year. And we didn't have to give them back until the Gulf blowout last year. Now they're deployed in the Gulf of Mexico. So we deployed these in the rivers. Just to remind you, this is a different river system than you're used to. This is what it looks like for about 5 months of the year. And even under natural conditions, there's a pretty good oxygen sag in this river. It's sealed under ice, no photosynthesis because of deep snow on it, and lots of organic matter from both the wetlands and probably a bit from these bitumen deposits getting into the system. Well, going back a few decades, in 1990, one of the Alberta environment scientists and I had done some preliminary studies. We flew in by helicopter and set up these automatic water samplers that showed that there were pH depressions already at that time that were comparable to what were being seen in eastern Canada and the Adirondacks for pH depression with spring melt. And we tried to get some money to study this, and we were told it cost too much, so we never did get the money. I have the conductivity data to go with this, and they showed that at those spring periods with this depression, about 80% of the water in the river was snowpack. So judging from Scandinavia and other eastern North American work, should have been big concentrations of some of the metallic pollutants and so on. This was the typical snow profile from near the plant. What we did is to take snow profiles from each of the sites where we did the river sampling, melt the stuff down, and filter it. And the protocols called for us to filter 4 liters of water, but we couldn't get anywhere near that through a filter. So just to orient you, these are the sort of white membrane filters that you normally use. This is upstream at Fort McMurray and going downstream to Fort Chip on the Athabasca. And these little legs are these 3 sites on each of the tributaries. The red indicate where major developments are for the oil sands industry. And in blue are other features. Fort McKay's a Cree Chippewayan community. Fort McMurray is the sort of hub of all of this development. Bitumen was a little sort of 1940s lab in what looked like a chicken house where they did some of the early oil sands work in Fort Chip. And the yellow numbers are distance between these in kilometers. So you can see this tendency for the filters to get blacker due to higher particulates near the center of this system. These are the particulates that came out of 900 milliliters of this water. And the filtrate looked like this. This is an unimpacted site, melted in a stainless steel container. At an impacted site, there was actually a layer of oil on top of the water. And when you wipe that out with a paper towel looked like that. So we actually had to ship some more stainless steel containers out because we couldn't reuse these for unimpacted sites. And when we did the analyses, we found this not unexpected tail off. This red line is 50 kilometers from the two upgrader stacks, which are right across the river from each other in site AR6, right where Syncrude and Suncor have these facilities. You can see this exponential tail off in these things. We decided by eye that 50 kilometer radius was more or less the level of impact. And I'll show you here just a few quick examples of what we found. This is total PAHs. On this one, this is south running north with AR6 where the upgraders are. The black is what's in the particulate fraction that I showed you, and the red is what's in the dissolved fraction, with the sum being the total. And these side ones are the tributaries where we had samples coming in. So you can see this sort of bullseye pattern with high deposition near the sites. Same pattern pretty much for mercury, arsenic, lead. Vanadium is regarded as a sure indicator of oil sands activity, and I could go on and show you many, many more of these. When you lump them and plotted them together, background sites are over 50 kilometers from these. They're the white bars, and the gray bars are within 50 kilometers. When you lump all of within and beyond 50 millimeters, for D is dissolved and P is particulate, you see a very clear pattern. Industry, via this atmospheric output into the snow, is adding to this snowpack. Typically, you would expect all of those would be highly concentrated during 2 or 3 weeks during snowmelt. Nobody has looked at that other than these pH and conductivity studies that we did 2 plant doublings ago. So I think Environment Canada is finally going to do that. Very briefly, so I can get on to the next, we did the same thing with the tributaries. In this case, black is winter samples and gray is summer samples. And you can see this got muddied a bit because some of what we had decided were undeveloped sites based on 2006 GIS photos had been developed by the time we sampled in early 2008. We didn't realize that until the 2008 GIS photos came out about 2 months after we were done. So we were able to make corrections for the summer sampling, but the best we were able to do is to, rather than zero development versus over 25%, less than 25% versus more. And still you can see a very clear pattern for most of the contaminants of higher concentrations where there was land disturbance. And the same for the Athabasca River. Here again, rather than show you every site and every contaminant, these are upstream, near development, downstream of development and in the Athabasca Delta and Lake Athabasca. Again, black is winter and gray is summer. You can see the highest concentrations are always in the area of development. Often they don't go back to background levels all the way downstream. So again, a pretty clear indication that industry is adding to the load. So we published this in 2 papers in the National Academy, and one pointing out the discrepancies in nature. And what we claimed was pretty modest. We didn't see any violations of Canadian guidelines. We don't have standards for any of these pollutants, so they're not legally enforceable in any case. So a few exceedances, as they're called. There's no guidelines for polycyclic aromatic compounds at all. So that was pretty unexciting. But we saw that we concluded that there were major industry-related inputs that added to the natural loads. And that this meant violation of the Fisheries Act for an obvious reason. There are no concentrations mentioned in the Fisheries Act. It's an absolute prohibition of adding anything to a water or near a water that is toxic to fish, or that would deter fish development by toxifying any organisms. So it was enough to get politicians very excited. I sent copies of the papers as a courtesy to both federal and provincial ministers. They both declared that we were wrong, that their data showed that there were no impacts. Though the Alberta minister, when asked, admitted that he hadn't read our paper. The federal minister phoned me up one day, about 4 days after he had said this, and said, well, he'd read the paper and talked to some of his senior scientists, and he'd like to see the data. He said, if I fly out this afternoon, can you meet me at the airport and show me the data? Which I did, and by the end, he was obviously convinced. And I said, well, what should I do? I said, well, why don't you get a panel of other senior scientists to look at our data and what's gone on and write you a report. Meanwhile, the premier of the province, who's a very sincere guy, who's way over his head in what he was doing, said, well, gee, we've had run-ins with this guy before and we've always lost. Maybe we should get some other people to look at this. So I made the same suggestion to him. Rather than do a combined panel, they each appointed a panel. And when the province didn't like the results of the first panel, they appointed a second panel. Meanwhile, RAMP had its own panel to review their program. The Auditor General of Canada threw a panel, and the Royal Society of Canada had a panel. So you can get all of these online. There's panelitis for a year with virtually every senior scientist in Canada viewing our data and RAMP and so on. And they all came to identical conclusions that they didn't have good background data. And this shows you the problem in 2 slides. This is for polycyclic aromatics. This was the Regional Aquatic Monitoring Program's detection, 20 nanograms per liter. Actually, if you took individual congeners, it'd be 20 to 200. But these were our actual values. They couldn't see them at this low site. And if you took our highest site, they would only sum the bars that went through that 20 line, or worse. And as a result, if you do the sums on this one, we came up with almost 700 nanograms per liter. The individual congener toxicities aren't known, so they sum them, but it's known that in similar situations, 400 is about the threshold for toxicity. They were declaring that there was no problem because they couldn't detect over 400. So, and I could show you analogs for some of the metals. So the reports were not very kind. This is from the provincial panel, the executive summary. The minister, I'm sure, spent a couple of sleepless nights after reading this and this. And this is what they had to say about our studies, which contrasted to the mouthings of the ministers. And as a result, the papers followed this very closely. And the last thing was that they demanded that the government give me an apology, which they never did, of course. So the last panel to report was what the minister called the world-class monitoring panel. After this panel of kooky left-wing scientists, all members of the National Academy, said that their monitoring was substandard, he said, well, we'll have a panel develop a international renowned monitoring program. People he appointed were 4 scientists and 7 business people. And the 4 scientists convinced the others. And they said, this is how to do it, but you can't run this from Environment Canada and or Alberta Environment. You've lost the trust of the people. This has to be run by an independent panel. still hasn't been implemented. That was last July. Meanwhile, the minister's lost his job, the premier's lost his job, the head of monitoring for the oil sands in Alberta environment's lost his job. And there's just total silence on the whole issue. Just going to go into very quickly at one other thing. One of the problems for people downstream has been increased deformities in fish. And somehow this rang true. This is one of Peter Hodson's students who did a study of embryonic toxicity of whitefish and other species that were hatched on these bitumen-rich sediments in the river. There was about 95% mortalities, and of the 5% that survived, huge lists of deformities. When we started collecting fish downstream, which we did by putting a freezer in Fort Chipewyan and getting people to bring their fish in and filling out forms as to where and when they were caught and so on, we collected some really nice specimens like this, and a whitefish spinal deformity, pike with two tails, hematomas, which were described in the embryonic studies. Here's an adult with big hematomas on its side, eye and mouth deformities, another tumor, this on a burbot, a super walleye, the other eye is normal. The description in the embryonic studies versus what was caught as adults in these nets made you think these are just the embryos grown up, a few survivors that these people are catching. Meanwhile, I found two fisheries scientists who worked on the system since the 1970s. One of them had a whole string of field notebooks, the other had a couple of old reports. They didn't see any deformities in the 70s either. Native people started reporting these in the 90s, and there was very little monitoring in the 80s and 90s by Western scientists, but when this RAMP program started up, they started monitoring, and in these inquiries, they admitted that they were getting 5 to 7% abnormalities in the fish they were catching. Well, I don't know if there's any contaminants in these fish. Nobody's looked yet. My guess is they're not very contaminated. They're contaminated when they're that long and deformed. They've swum downstream and lived in a pretty clean lake Athabasca. So nobody's going to eat them because of the way they look. Some of the natives won't even feed them to their dogs. They're probably safe to eat, but can you sell them in a safe way? I doubt it. So the final thing, this so-called in situ development, which now all being thumped on about these mines are saying, oh, well, most of our development's going to be these in situ techniques. They're way better environmentally. Well, this is one site. This is the tar sands mines. This is Fort McMurray, about 100 kilometers away, to give you an idea of scale. These are little Métis and native communities. This is before major development. This is after an in situ development. They have up to 32 well pads per square kilometer. They have seismic lines first for exploration, and then roads to put in these well pads and pipelines to haul the material out. And this so-called linear disturbance just mops up the landscape. You put any reasonable buffer zone around these is set by studies of woodland caribou or large predators like wolves, and 95% of that is alien territory. So studies are just coming out. I missed a slide, there's the one. Caribou are in great decline. Anyhow, some logical next steps would be a detailed study of what's causing these fish health problems. Probably not something they can reconcile at this point. They've studied contaminants out of those streams, but they're also fish factories. There are data from the 70s that show that each of these little streams is producing 20 or 30,000 fish that migrate into the river. Nobody's looked at them, and they still do. Community health. There's some really direct methods. Epidemiology is fine if you got a couple 100,000 people, but in small communities in eastern Canada, they've gone in and measured direct body burdens in things like breast milk and notochord milk, which of course target the most sensitive part of the human life cycle. And they've shown high levels of things like dioxins and PCBs and so on. Why not use the same sorts of techniques to see whether people are really getting contaminant loads by fish and perhaps some of the mammals, what the vector is. The monitoring, I think, should be done by Environment Canada. They have the expertise, but nobody trusts any agency that's under the control of a politician anymore. So there's got to be some transparency lent by a panel of independent scientists. They've got to have some tougher conditions, as I've listed here, for approving new mines. Right now, their environmental impact assessment is a joke, and they can't understand why Europeans think this. It's obvious to anybody familiar with these things. And basically, they really need to pull up their socks on the whole thing. This environmental impact assessment process is a joke. This is a direct quote from my paper in Nature last year. It's like going to the opera. You know what's going to happen when the fat lady sings after millions of dollars have been spent. Things have gone to and fro, so it's all just entertainment. Anyhow, thank you for listening.